Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Daron Acemoglu. He is an institute professor at MIT. In 2005, he received the John Bates Clark Medal, given to economists under the age of 40, judged to have made the most significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. In 2012, he was awarded the Erwin Plein Nemers Prize in Economics for work of lasting significance. And in 2016, he received the BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award in Economics, Finance, and Management for his lifetime contributions. Daron is the co-author with James Robinson of a book called The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. Daron, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, John.
Okay. So let's start with the fundamental groundwork of this theory that you carry throughout an analysis of many different cultures throughout history. This is about liberty. This is about freedom. And you cite John Locke as defining what freedom is really all about. People have liberty when?
People have liberty when they are free to make their choices and shape their lives. And we actually take a somewhat broader notion than what early philosophers subscribed to. And we say you really need to be free from the fear of violence as well as the excessive economic, political, and social influence and power of others on your choices in order to have that freedom.
Mm-hmm. And this is a time of crisis for so many people with regard to that freedom from violence and intimidation and demeaning acts. You talk about how many different places people are fleeing in the Middle East, Africa, and Central America because not for higher income, but just because they're trying to protect themselves and their families from violence and fear.
Absolutely. I think that's been a constant motivation throughout ages. And you see that in every culture, in every society, there is an effort to avoid that kind of power of people over them. And you see that today in Hong Kong. You know, people are not protesting for income. They're not protesting for, something, that they want concretely. They're protesting for having the freedom to shape their lives.
Mm-hmm. Now, the model that you engage involves using some of the work of a 17th century writer, Hobbes, and the Leviathan. Let's talk about the metaphor of the Leviathan.
Yeah, so I think, Hobbes is this towering intellect. Perhaps today is not mentioned in every discussion as some other philosophers and social scientists are, but his impact on the way that we think about the world and the way that we think about politics is very deep. He's in some sense the founder of the state system, because the key thing he said is, you really need powerful states that are able to impose laws, because that's the only way you avoid chaos, you avoid anarchy, you avoid violence. And we all sort of start from that sort of perception in thinking about sovereignty, about states, about laws. But the thing about Hobbes is that he missed that when you have that sort of powerful states, it's really very difficult to control them, and they can be as much of a threat to liberty and to economic flourishing as the absence of those states. And in fact, the world is much richer, it's much more diverse. And that's why Hobbes's vision and the people who articulated visions of end of history where every country would converge to some sort of liberal democratic system or market economy, they weren't completely satisfactory, because you see this diversity. You see societies which are very well organized and avoid laws, and that much of our human existence has been in such societies. You see countries like China where you have very capable state institutions, but they're very despotic. They impose order, they impose laws without input from society, they repress when necessary. And then you have the narrow corridor where you have this balance between state and society, which creates a very different type of state, one we call the shackled Leviathan, because it's just like Hobbes's Leviathan, very capable, very powerful, but ultimately tightly shackled at its ankles by society's willingness to get engaged in politics and keep it accountable.
Mm-hmm. Now, that model that you've been describing is illustrated through a XY axis the power of the state is the vertical axis, and that's the despotic Leviathan. And if there's too much power of the state, of course, there's no liberty. But on the other side, there's the power of society on the horizontal line, and the power of society moves you away from freedom as well if it's not in that narrow corridor where there's a balance between the power of state and the power of society.
That's right. And that's why liberty is so delicate, so precarious, because you need this balance. You know, it's not just a question of building the right designs, of building the right constitutions. We sometimes sort of lull ourselves by saying, you know, we're secure in the United States because we have the right constitution, we have the brilliant designs of our founding fathers. But really, that's not where liberty comes from. That's not where democratic organization comes from. It really critically depends on society's organization. So it's why you need society to be vigilant. But if society becomes too irreverent and completely disobeys laws, if it becomes excessively suspicious of hierarchy and political power, that it sort of undercuts the state institutions and their ability to get things done, then you have a different type of end to liberty. Because without laws, how do you make sure that the strong don't get their way? How do you make sure that, you know, elites, be they economic or political, don't start manipulating the system? The system doesn't become personalized. The system doesn't become completely degenerate. So for all of these things, you need laws to remain strong, and that's why excessive power of society as well as excessive power of the state are inimical to liberty.
Mm-hmm. Let's put a couple of more metaphors into the mix here, because the cage of norms figures into some of the analysis that you do of countries with strong kinships and tribes.
That's right. That's actually very interesting, because the other aspect of Hobbes, in fact, he spends quite a bit of time on this, and many social scientists have been influenced by that, is that he describes places without the strong Leviathan, the sea monster ruling over society, as lawless, the fight of every man against every man, nasty, brutish, and short lives. But when you look at most societies that have existed in human history, and some of them that survive today, small scale, stateless, they're not excessively violent. Now, does that mean that they solve the problem of creating the right architecture for rights and liberties for people? No. And you can see that from the fact that they're actually dirt poor. They're really not able to get anything done economically. But it's more than that. The way that they actually resolve those conflicts and disputes is by setting up a very highly choreographed, constricted set of traditions and norms that limit every aspect of behavior. Women become subservient to men, young become subservient to old, certain market activities are banned, accumulating too much prestige is banned, accumulating too much power is banned, and all of these things mean that you can contain conflict without Hobbes's war of everyone against everyone, but you do that at the expense of taking out all kinds of free choice from people with quite bad consequences.
Let's take the example of India, which is a powerful one because of the caste system there. Even though they have democracy, there isn't a whole lot of liberty within the caste system because of the cage of norms.
Right. That's super interesting, and that's why we spend a chapter on it. You know, in many ways, India is an enigma, right? It's the world's second largest country, world's largest democracy. It's been actually quite a pretty successful democracy. But on the other hand, it has been completely unable to eradicate poverty, provide public services such as schooling, health, infrastructure. It is chaotic. Corruption is rampant. Politicians are unaccountable. So why is that? And the answer that we provide is that, you know, throughout history, especially recent history, but it's actually very deep-rooted, Indian society has been fragmented, at war with itself, because of this very, very rigid caste system. The people are in their caste, they have to behave, they are in a social hierarchy according to that caste, their occupations are determined by that, who they can marry is determined by that, what kind of jobs and what kind of businesses, where they live is all determined then. But more importantly also, their political and social activities are determined at that. And this is really not a question of laws. Once upon a time, there were laws that banned from different castes getting engaged in different things. You could get killed for example, praying if you were not from the right caste, reading some of the chants if you were not from the right caste. But today, after Indian independence, where the Indian Constitution was partly written by a towering figure, Ambedkar, who was himself from the untouchable Dalit caste, caste differences and caste restrictions have been banned in India. But you look at it, and they still shape many aspects of life because certain things are stronger than laws. They persist in norms. They persist in the social relations in which people are engaged in day in and day out in their communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it struck me just how difficult it was for the lower castes, referred to at the time as the untouchables, and that there were many places where they were treated like less than human.
Absolutely. Ambedkar himself, now we're talking about 80 years ago, it's 90 years ago, but, had to go to school where he couldn't drink from the fountain because the fountain was not allowed for the untouchable caste. He couldn't sit at the table. He was constantly viewed as an outcast. He couldn't form friendships. I mean, that is extremely common. Even today, there are probably up to 5 million people in India that are predominantly from the lowest untouchable Dalit caste who work as manual scavengers, cleaning by hand toilets or animal carcasses. And again, this is not by law. Nobody says that by law you have to do that, but it's the social norms of the local village communities that really forces them into those kinds of occupations. But another important point here is that once you have a society fragmented and divided like this, it does a lousy job of keeping its politicians accountable, and that's why you cannot get politicians not to be corrupt or provide the right public services in India. That's part of the challenge.
Let's compare and contrast the United States on that, because you discuss the liberty that's available to us, and what happened as the Federalist founders were making a strong central government, but at the same time the Bill of Rights was shackling that. But the Constitution is a bit sullied because of the slavery issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're, of course, so fortunate relative to most other nations in the world, but some of the same issues, in a much more minuscule way, are present in the United States. Our big problem has been dealing with slavery and the issue of African American rights throughout our history. The Constitution was sullied partly because it had to make huge compromises to give power over Southern plantation owners over their slaves. And even after Civil War, the issue of discrimination, norm-based and sometimes rule-based in the South, based on local legislations and local laws, did not disappear, especially after the Reconstruction period ended and the redemption period started. But that really illustrates two broader points, as well as the issues that we've been talking about in the context of India. One is that building liberty and the institutions protecting it is a work in progress. You don't get there overnight. And sometimes it's going to take very long time, and that's been the case in Europe, and it's been the case in the U.S. in many different ways. And second, when you actually start making big progress, it's not because of the Constitution. The Constitution didn't say, didn't organize the civil rights movement, did not get rid of the discrimination, the Jim Crow in the South. It was because society mobilized and formed broad coalitions and find the right compromises to get people around the project of actually ending that discrimination, allowing African Americans to have the right to vote, the right to choose their occupations, the right to migrate out of their communities if they wanted to. And that was a big turning point for liberty in the United States.
But you did devote a chapter to the problem of Ferguson, and that sort of illustrates how bad it can get when everybody's not treated with the same liberty.
Absolutely. I think Ferguson illustrates two things. One is exactly what you said, which is that sort of discrimination, even though it started changing, it's still deep-rooted. Norms, just like we talked about in the context of India, don't die overnight. But also, secondly, that the architecture of the Constitution by making federal power very restricted, because there was fear that that federal power would intervene in bad ways, as well as there was fear that the federal power would intervene with issues of slavery in the South. All of that contributed to a situation where state capacity, especially in some communities, is so low that monitoring the police force, finding the right sort of schooling, education institutions, the right sort of services for the community, those things become very difficult.
Mm-hmm. And I was taken by the fact that, of course, we know that in Ferguson it was almost completely white police force policing a black community.
Absolutely.
And that
Absolutely.
they were...
And again, something like that could persist because at the time, the U.S. had a African-American president, African-American attorney general, but they had no power to actually start fixing the Ferguson local police department unless, it reached a crisis proportion because, again, of the, architecture of the Constitution, which served us very well in some respects, but also has created some of our inability to deal with local problems, poverty, lack of opportunities in many communities around the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's bring in the Red Queen now, because that's an important part of the evolution of a nation toward liberty.
Yeah, so, we talk about this. We already talked about the narrow corridor and the process, state and society hitting that balance. But the key to that balance is the ability of state and society to evolve together. State institutions have to keep on evolving all the time because the problems we're dealing with are changing every day. Somebody like Alexander Hamilton, who was very keen on federal power and regulation and so on and so forth, he could not have foreseen the sort of responsibilities that state institutions today would have to shoulder. But how do we deal with that? Well, at the same time as these state institutions are becoming more powerful and more intrusive, we need society to start running faster so that it can monitor them, it can keep them accountable, it can actually have its voice heard. So that made us think of what Lewis Carroll describes in Alice in the Wonderland with the Red Queen. The Red Queen says, in this country, it takes all the running you can do just to remain in the same place. So society, to maintain its same place relative to the state, has to keep on running, and the state itself has to keep on running in order to deal with all this different varied challenges. So that creates a situation in which there is this positive dynamics that they're both together running and they're building capacity, but it also creates this instability that this tussle could actually get out of balance and crush us out of the corridor.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about a couple of societies that were in the corridor and what the factors were that made that happen. The first is the Athenians.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's super interesting. One of the reasons why I love the Athenian story is that this suspicion of hierarchy, suspicion of elites that you see in stateless societies that prevents them from building laws, it's actually present among the Athenians. They are extremely afraid of powerful people, and they develop all these institutions and norms to put elites in their place. They ostracize them. They tell them you cannot tell other people what to do. But the key is that then they are able to institutionalize these through democratic processes, democratic institutions that they find. And as a result, Athens, classic Athens, is not only the birthplace of democracy, which we rightly celebrate, but it's also the birthplace of state institutions. You see unparalleled state institutions. They build road networks. They regulate economic activity. They have orphanages. They have district courts judges. They have a form of social insurance system. They start printing money. So all of these things are made possible because of the Red Queen effect, because society becomes more able to keep elites in check, and then state then can have a longer leash to build greater capacity and deal with more complex problems.
Mm-hmm. And how much did Draco and Solon contribute to the shackling the Leviathan?
Well, Solon is a critical figure, and he actually illustrates another key thing, because he's the one who sort of starts writing the constitution that becomes the sort of template for the rest of Athenian development. And what's so interesting about Solon is that he's actually a compromise figure. He is a very successful trader and a general, and he's brought to power because the elites trust him. But at the same time, he's brought to power with a mandate to curb the power of the elites and empower society more. And that's why many of his reforms are in the direction of making Athens more democratic. But he also does other tremendous things. He does a land reform and creates much more equal distribution of land because, as I was emphasizing with the notion of liberty, you cannot have liberty when economically most people are subservient to landowners that accumulate all the lands in their hands. So he creates a more equal distribution of economic opportunities. He also introduces all of these ways in which people are protected against the excessive powers of the elites, and it's that balance then subsequent Athenian politicians and political processes build upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Something that I'm not that well versed in world history, unfortunately, but I got a good education from you in the chapter on the allegory of good government, because I didn't realize how much was accomplished in the Italian city-states between the first and second millennia transition of CE under the Tuscan sun. That fresco in Siena.
That's really fascinating. It's you know, what's the thing is that, of course, the allegory of good government is our chapter 5. That's such a hopeful story because you see all the good things that come from the shackled Leviathan, the positive side of the Red Queen effect, how they have actually built these really sophisticated institutions for keeping politicians in check while at the same time people participate. And out of that, you get these amazing economic flourishing, very great innovations, new ways of economic organization. But then, unfortunately, we come back to them in the 13th century, and that's when you see the Italian city-states one after another leave the corridor because they turn life in the corridor into one of a zero-sum affair where nobody trusts each other, everybody's fighting, elites are trying to get control back, and the population, gives in to the siren calls of strong leaders, and it's a cautionary tale too.
Mm-hmm. And Europe had a lot of the right elements so that eventually liberty evolved in so many different ways. England is a great example of how that came to be.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time on European history, and I think we have to. Because, look, you cannot talk about democracy, rights, liberty, without acknowledging that many of these things first took shape in Europe. So there was something exceptional about Europe. Was it European culture? Was it European religion? Was it European geography? And our answer is no, none of that. All of these things are important, but they're important in a particular confluence. There isn't a culture, there isn't a geography, there isn't a heritage that says you are going to become democratic, you're going to become liberty-loving, and a different one that says that's not going to happen. It's really about that balance. And what enabled Europe to slowly, very, very slowly, over centuries build that balance was that it tapped into two very different traditions. The tradition of the Roman institutions that had the blueprints for law, strong state institutions, administrative structures, and the church hierarchy. And on the other hand, it had the traditions, political arrangements of the Germanic tribes that had come to invade much of Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire that was very participatory. Leaders were transitory, leaders were very constrained. There were all these assemblies that people participated in collective decisions at the same time. And it was the fusion of these two traditions that really put in place the roots of that balance of the corridor.
Okay. So in contrast to that, we see a nation that has a heritage of millennia of not valuing human life. And I'm talking about China and the various dynasties and the massacres that occurred there and the despotic growth that they've experienced through the years. Despotic growth does work for a time sometimes.
Yeah, it does work for a time, but doesn't forever. I think that's a very important lesson. And it's also important to put China into perspective. It's not that China has always been that way. If you go back far in history, more than 2,500 years ago, China had its own period that looks like the Italian city-states. But then intense conflict and centuries of wars creates a new equilibrium, which is much more top-down, strong rulers armed with strong laws that are imposed on society. And that becomes much more deep-rooted, especially once they start building strong state institutions in the form of bureaucracies, meritocratic imperial hierarchies, And at that point, the system sort of self-replicates. And I think the despotism of China is very interesting. China is not despotic because it is mostly violent. In fact, for centuries, it works relatively peacefully. Violence comes and disrupts the equilibrium, with big rebellions, precisely because the despotic system doesn't listen to society. It's always top-down. And at some point, people say, okay, we cannot have our voices heard. The only channel for us to have any influence is to rebel. And then that happens because the democratic institutions, because the pathways for that influence to be heard is not there. That rebellion translates into a huge carnage and huge instability, and the whole economic system collapses. But then another dynasty comes about. And some of these dynasties, exactly as you pointed out, are able to undergird this sort of despotic growth. What they haven't generally been able to do is make that sustainable, and that requires much more innovation, much more experimentation, and that's just much more easily done in the corridor.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned top-down, and this is a question I had written down in the margin somewhere in the book. Is it essential that things be built from the bottom up in order to get into the narrow corridor?
Well, I think you need both. It's both true for the economy and it's both true for law. You cannot have bottom-up law. Law, at the end of the day, is something a centralized authority imposes. But if you look at laws, how they evolve, for example, in Europe versus in China, it's very different. The legalist tradition in China is that the emperor and his advisors decide the law, everybody obeys it. If you look at how laws emerged in the Middle Ages in Europe, in the Merovingian, Carolingian Empire in England, is very different. They come from the codification of existing norms. And even monarchs, they don't say, I'm imposing laws. People like Clovis, Charlemagne, King Alfred, they say, we are actually transmitting to you laws that the society itself decided. So it's this process of laws coming up bottom up with an input, but then being implemented by a centralized authority. The same is true for the economy. It would be chaos. It would not lead to economic growth if we did not have institutions to regulate economic activity, to create centralized market, to make sure that the markets function and people don't cheat, to have courts to decide disputes. All of those are centralized institutions. But you also need the bottom-up element where people say, I have a different idea than yours. I'm going to pursue my idea. I'm going to come up with new products, and I'm going to try to uproot the existing economic order. So it's the meeting of these two processes that's really critical for sustained economic growth.
Mm-hmm. Very good. We only have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to go through the distinctions between Guatemala and Costa Rica, which is a very interesting part of the book. But since we only have a short time, what would you say is the future of liberty in the world?
Look, I think we are at a critical point, and it's our own making. Great Depression was a huge shock. It led to massive unemployment everywhere around the world, and we rose up to that challenge. Now we have a much more man-made disaster at the moment, and it's because our state institutions, our elites, our vision has not responded to changes that have taken place over the last 3 decades. Everywhere around the world there is this discontent. You have this populist leaders, authoritarians, disruption coming up because we're all going through the same problem. We've had technologies, globalization, increasing wealth and riches around the world, but they have been very unequally distributed, and state institutions haven't done anything to redress that problem. So I think when that happens in history, you see that trust in institution erodes, and that creates disaster. So what we have to do is to find the right coalitions, to make compromises in order to build and rebuild and redesign those state institutions to make shared prosperity easier to achieve. Better education, better healthcare, better markets, better job opportunities. All of these are actually within our reach. So we have to find a way of achieving a consensus around these topics. And I think understanding where liberty comes from and how you protect it, I think that is useful for us to understand how to achieve those challenges.
Excellent. Thank you for that. The book is The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. We've been talking with Daron Acemoglu. Sorry, I messed up your name there. Acemoglu.
That's all right, don't worry. Thanks, John. That's really great talking to you.
It's a thought-provoking book, and I remind our listeners, if you don't catch our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can catch us on our YouTube channel at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening, and make it a great day.